All right, good evening and welcome to the New Haven Museum. My name is Cynthia Riccio. I am the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum. Tonight we are so happy to have author Keith Marshall Jones III, who will share a new and definitive account of Inland Connecticut's only Revolutionary War engagement on April 27, 1777. This event is part of NH250, an ongoing series of programming developed by the New Haven Museum to complement America 250. Culminating with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the series will highlight inclusive, local, and lesser-known stories connecting past and present. Also, in these times where museums are starting to struggle a bit, we want to make sure to keep our programming free and open to everyone. So any donation helps fund our educational workshops, community events, and hands-on learning experiences for adults, children, and families. Every dollar makes a difference in keeping culture and creativity accessible to all. You can donate today downstairs on your way out and be part of something truly inspiring. Now on to our program. Jones's discussion will be based on his latest book, which is in the back if you are interested, The Battle of Ridgefield, Benedict Arnold, the Patriot Militia, and the surprising 1777 battle that galvanized revolutionary Connecticut, which tells how Benedict Arnold and the Patriots dashed British hopes for crown hegemony over southwestern Connecticut. According to Connecticut State Historian Emeritus Walter Woodward, his work shows the action was a more complex and significant revolutionary moment than previously realized. The Battle of Ridgefield was a militia action involving local farmers and merchants against a professional enemy thrice their size, Jones notes. It reminds us today, when democracy itself is under siege, the independence that was won at the grassroots level, and that is how it must be perpetrated. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you all on this magnificent evening for stepping back into the past instead of off on your patio. Pleasure to be here. One, this is the first time I've presented outside of Fairfield County, so it's going to be a different set of questions I might expect from the audience. Thank you, Patrick. First, I'll start with a question. How many times did a British army invade Connecticut during the Revolution? Three? Would you say?
I say three.
You say three?
Two.
Two?
Six.
Five. They close. You know, hey, you got both bookends. We had New London and Fort Groton, which Fort Griswold, which Arnold took out. We had New Haven, of course, and East Haven, which more the brunt of the action, other than Worcester's house, unfortunately. We have Norwalk, we have Fairfield, and then we have the Danbury raid, which preceded them all. And the Battle of Ridgefield followed the burning of Danbury. Now, I'm going to talk about the Battle of Ridgefield because I think it's the most important of all five invasions for two reasons. One, there was an actual battle in which a full brigade of Connecticut militia stood up to the British Army. Two, the consequences of the Ridgefield action were long-lasting and far more widespread than we initially thought. First, though, before we go back into the past, I'd like to just keep the words of Joseph Ellis in mind. Joseph won the Pulitzer, of course, for Founding Brothers, but he warns us to keep in mind that the past is not history, but a much vaster region of the dead, gone, unknowable, or forgotten. History is what we choose to remember. We choose to remember. And when it comes to the American Revolution, we choose to see it through the eyes of great men, the Founding Fathers. And when it comes to the battlefield, we choose to see it basically through the eyes of Washington's Continental Army. And everyone has seen this on a stamp It's the poor, starving rabble of an army and Washington at Valley Forge. And for children growing up, so much of what they perceive as the American Revolution is through Washington's eyes. And in Washington's eyes, the militia were close to worthless. He wrote to John Hancock in September of 1776, to place any dependence upon militia is assuredly resting upon a broken staff. Later in the year, the militia who come in, you cannot tell how, go, you cannot tell when, and act, you cannot tell where, consume your provisions, exhaust your stores, and leave you at a critical moment. These, sir, are the men I am supposed to depend upon? Well, 4 years later, he hadn't changed. Writing to Jefferson, I was never witness to a single instance that I can countenance an opinion of militia or raw troops being fit for the real business of fighting. That's because when the real business of fighting took place, Washington usually was not there, and so he didn't see it. Taking a revisiting look at the militia tells another story, maybe even the larger part of the war for independence. Collectively, over 100,000 men in the state militias. The British never had more than 35,000, and more often it was around 25,000. 80% of the land engagements, 1,171 of 1319, had militia participation. Even Saratoga, 3/4 of General Gates's army, was militia, not continental. They policed the home front. What did that mean? They kept the loyalists under control. They policed the borders. They kept the Native Americans from intruding. And they harassed the devil out of British supply lines. You add that up for 8 years, and the cost to King George from the American militia was substantial. Now, Connecticut had most likely the most organized and disciplined of all the militias. Why? Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Trumbull was a sitting governor before the war, sitting governor during the war, and saw the war through. So the militia that he had was the only one of the state militias whose governor was in place during the war. And it was organized into 6 brigades, consisting of 3 to 4 regiments each. And you can see on the map, the regiments that are in blue are the 4th Brigade of Gold Silverman, who lived in Fairfield. And that's where the action of Ridgefield I'm going to talk about involves. You can see that's nearly 400 square miles, the militia of the 4th Brigade, including all of Fairfield County and up into New Milford and even up to Kent. At that time was still part of the Fairfield militia. So when people said they were slow to react, my God, how long does it take to get men from 400 square miles to a single place, particularly if you don't know where that place is going to be? Well, the man who made the militia come to action in Fairfield County and around, and is the first of 6 characters I want to share with you, because history takes place because people make things happen. And people who made things happen at that point in our history depended on this man, Sir William Howe. He's in Manhattan. He's taken Staten Island, Long Island. He's driven the Patriots out of northern New Jersey. He's been knighted. He's the most decorated officer in the British Army, general officer. He's related to King George. He has an impeccable battlefield record, a hero at Bunker Hill for the British. He led his men up the hill, blood all over him, brains spattered on his uniform. He was a hero when the British captured Quebec in the French and Indian War, and well respected by his troops. But he had an issue, and that was, okay, I own New York. How do I put an end to this war? And he was in the driver's seat, and he sent a plan to England that had 3 prongs. He was going to end the war in 1777 by sending 10,000 men from Rhode Island to take Boston, sending 8,000 men to cover New Jersey and threaten Philadelphia, maybe take it, and another 10,000 men to go up the Hudson's and join an army coming down from Canada, cut off New England, and that would be it. New England was the head of the snake, cut it off. On December 20th, he decided to make it a two-pronged plan. Why? Because King George had refused to give him the 15,000 extra men he wanted to pull off Plan A. So he downsized it to just holding on to New York and Rhode Island, defending New Jersey, and with his main army go after Philadelphia. Then what happened? Washington crosses the Delaware, Trenton and Princeton. The Patriots are awake. We come to another plan by General Howe he sends to London. There will be two armies, both going to Philadelphia, and we'll trap it in a pincer movement, one by land, one by sea. Then, a couple months later, he has another idea. One army to take Philadelphia by sea, and then send 3,000 troops under Major General Tryon as a diversion along the Hudson, and to enter Connecticut as circumstances may point out. Now, where did that come from? Where did that come? All of these global domination armies, and suddenly he's asking King George for this. Well, William Tryon was a vain and ambitious man. This may or may not be his picture. I wanted to reprint this in my book, but the Tryon Mansion Museum in North Carolina said they don't think it's really him, and they didn't want to give permission. But the North Carolina Museum of History posits it as Tryon. So in the absence of another picture, he may have looked something like that. He was the governor of New York, the fifth governor of New York, and by all accounts, a competent governor who tried to balance the crown interest with the rich aristocratic planters, and as well as the wealthy merchant tradesmen in New York, as well as make a few bucks on the side for himself. When General Howe invaded New York and took over, he was out of a job. It was basically a military dictatorship, and he was nothing but a figurehead. So he became spy master for Howe. And he had a network all the way from Boston to Philadelphia of loyalists who were feeding him information. But what he really wanted to be was a general. He could see the cards laying on the table in front of him that you were nobody unless you were a general in Howe's army. So, what did he do? In December of 1776, this is before Washington crosses the Delaware, he wrote to George Germain, who was both his boss and Sir William Howe's boss, saying, a majority of the inhabitants of the Connecticut River are firm friends of the government, and he asked London to make him a major general. Next month, he proposed his plan to Sir William, who didn't have a high opinion, from what I can understand of Tryon, because he knew the difference between a political general and a real general. He'd earned his stars, so to speak. But King George blessed the plan and blesses Tryon's rank. And so on April 20, Howe reluctantly promoted him to Major General of Provincials. Now, why would he imagine that Connecticut was going to be loyal to the crown? Well, in southwestern Connecticut, nearly 1 out of 3 churchgoers went to the Church of England. It was closer to 1 out of 10 in New Haven County. The Church of England goers were in Fairfield County. Fairfield County has trading ties with New York, not Boston. You get to the Connecticut River and up, it's trading ties with Boston. There were many times the militia would not muster after the shot heard around the world at Lexington Concord, even after Bunker Hill. 5 towns in southwestern Connecticut had not disapproved of King George and sided with Continental Congress yet. It was not until December of 1776, only a year before. Several refugee regiments had been formed on Long Island from loyalists who crossed at night on boats to the Crown's open arms on Long Island, telling him of all the loyalists left behind, and why not bring an army and set us free. And then I mentioned not only did towns refuse to drop King George, but Tories at that time were only required to take an oath of passivity, not to disavow the crown, not to portray loyalty to the American colonies, but to simply remain passive. For all those reasons, Tryon thought if he could get an army into Connecticut, he could enhance his major generalship of provincials into something larger. So Sir William Howe gave this order to General Tryon on the 20th of April, just a few days ago from being 248 years ago. You will destroy large magazines of provisions and military stores formed by the enemy at Danbury in Connecticut. But he was a figurehead of a general. The real commander of Tryon's raid burning of Danbury and the British troops for that 5-day expedition was Brigadier General Sir William Erskine, who had been knighted 30 years earlier for glory on European battlefields. He truly commanded the expedition, and he was every inch the battlefield general that William Tryon was not. And in fact, only 2 years later, King George asked Erskine personally to come back and be his military counselor in London. Highly respected. One of these people lost in that past that's so unknowable, who was a major player that didn't write it down, so we didn't hear about it. With Erskine was a crack military strike force of 6 infantry regiments, all proven redcoat regiments. One of them was a regiment which Sir William Howe was the proprietary colonel. The Prince of Wales American Volunteer Regiment became the 7th. Those were Connecticut men primarily who had crossed the Sound and joined the British Provincial Army. There were 6 pieces of artillery in case they got into trouble, and a squadron of mounted dragoons for expeditionary exploration. There was also the best engineer that William Howe had. Handsome, huh? I mean, in those days, if you were in the aristocracy, you got that red coat on, groomed up, and had an oil painting made of yourself. And Archibald Robertson was no exception, who ultimately became a lieutenant general and head of the Royal Corps of Engineers. In his diary, which describes the whole expedition to Danbury and the Battle of Ridgefield afterward, he wrote, on the 25th, that's April, about 5 o'clock in the evening, landed at Cedar Point. That's right off of Norwalk. At 11 in the forenoon, the 26th, we reached Reading, and then marched forward to Danbury, which they seized with no opposition because loyalists along the way were applauding them, and they thought, Tryon may be right. Well, when John Adams found about this, he wrote to Abigail, and the stupid, sordid, cowardly, terrified country people let them pass without opposition. He was overstating the case, of course. As we saw earlier, because of this geographic scale of the Fairfield County militia, for them to even get together at any one place would take more than 24 hours. But they did. Major General David Wooster, who had rushed from New Haven to take command before Danbury was burned, wrote, there may be greater danger from the Western Tories than from the regulars. And that's on the day that they were actually in Danbury. So southwestern Connecticut was a little bit different from the rest of the provision state. There were still elements of Crown loyalty there waiting for the spark to be lit. The question was Tryon going to light it or not? Pardon? He wrote that to Governor Jonathan Trumbull, and he copied General Wadsworth, who commanded the 2nd Brigade of Connecticut Militia, which was the New Haven area brigade, asking them to rush to his aid and then pass the missive on to Governor Trumbull.
So the Tories were militia in support of the regulars?
The regulars are the British Redcoats, yeah. The Tories are the civilians who were passively waiting for the Crown to reassert itself, because there had been promised an army would come. It was the salvation they were hoping for. A British army would come, and then we can give these patriots who've read our mail, broke into our houses, boycotted our business, a taste of their own medicine. So it was no clear thing which way Southwest Connecticut was going to go, although the majority were still with the American cause. Well, rushing to defend Fairfield County was Gold Silliman's brigade of Connecticut militia. His 4 regiments, you could see they mustered 1,200 men. Their geography, if you can read, was essentially every town in Fairfield County, plus several, the 13th Woodbury, New Milford in Kent. But 250 had been sent to Peekskill, so at most he had was maybe 850 men against, 2,000 British who were trained regulars, and these were farm boys and old men and tradesmen and people who got excited when the guns started falling and picked up their own and came to the party. Just before Silliman brought his 600 men, which he had at this point in time, on the evening of the 26th of April, Danbury was in flames, part of it already. Who should arrive but David Wooster, Major General, Silliman's boss, in charge of the entire Connecticut militia. 66 years old, going on 67, rainy night, got on a horse and rode the 32 miles from here to Reading in the midst of rain. It's hard to imagine, right? Maybe 66-year-old generals at that time had a different constitution. At any rate,
Did he bring anyone with him? Or
that's a real question that we've been unable to truly answer. We know he brought his chief of staff with him, but it does not appear that he brought anything more than a few staff officers. He moved quickly and he bolted. Now, Wooster, as you know, at one time was the fair-haired boy of Connecticut generals during the French and Indian War. But as he grew old, he grew conservative, and he was blamed for losing Canada when we invaded Canada in 1770, into 75, into 76. And he took the blame for something that was really not his fault. No one could have taken Canada with half the troops that the British had at that time. He was passed over for promotion by Congress. Because of that, he asked for a court-martial. He was found innocent, but he lost confidence of Congress. And then, when encountering the British outside of Greenwich late in 1776, he didn't stand and fight, and he got a formal reprimand from General Washington, which is end of career. So you can only imagine Wooster, when hearing there's action going on in the Danbury area, saw a chance to have a last chapter of his career that could set things right. So off he rode. Who also, the same night, jumped on his horse. You know, Wooster was on what is now Wooster Street, down by Wooster Square, and I think Frank Pepe's restaurant is, if not next to where Wooster's house was, it's pretty darn close. So if he were still living there, he'd be having some pretty good pizza. Arnold lived on Water Street, down closer to the wharf, because he was a merchant, and that's where his income came from. He had more than ambition, because one, he'd been passed over for the second star of Major General for 5 generals by Congress who had clearly a weaker record. Two, he was not invited by Congress to set right some accounts in his financial for the defense of Valcour Island, where he had stopped the British invasion coming down where before. There were discrepancies in the account, and he wasn't given a fair trade of analysis by Congress. So he put his position as the number 2 man at Rhode Island, at Newport, on hold, and came to New Haven thinking about resigning. Wrote Washington he was going to resign. A letter arrived from Boston, which really crushed his spirit, because a 16-year-old society girl he had fallen in love with and proposed marriage, her mother interceded and turned him down and sent him a letter saying, no, 16-year-old Betsy Dubois is not going to be your wife. 16-year-old, he was, 34 at the time. But that's not exceptional. Wooster's wife was 30 years younger than he as well. It was a pattern, I guess. So he's been rejected by the heavenly Betsy, as they were called. He was passed over by Congress. Yet he won his colonelcy and he won his brigadier's star by battlefield valor. And darn it, he could do it again. So on his horse he got and rode, and he beat Wooster to the... They both came from New Haven. They did not come together. Why? These 2 guys were oil and water. Wooster was conservative and slow. Arnold was mercurial and impulsive. Wooster was 66. Arnold was 34. Arnold, I guess, encountered Wooster the first time in trying to get keys to the powder in New Haven so he could take his elite company of Governor's Foot Guards to the siege of Boston, which he did. Wooster resisted. When Wooster took over in Quebec, who did he take over from? Arnold. And he called Arnold a rube and not a real general. So for there was some back and forth that these two were on different pages. Arnold was George Washington's star. His fighting general, Wooster, had lost confidence. Both of these men find themselves the rainy night of the 26th of April in Reading, plotting strategy with Gold Silliman on what to do about Tryon's 2,000-man army. Well, you can see the map of Fairfield County, I hope. You can see where Tryon landed between Norwalk and Fairfield. You can see how they marched up through Reading and up to Danbury in the upper center, and you can see Bethel to the right. So Bethel is where the three American generals were putting their head together. But they didn't know what Tryon's next move was going to be. He might just go to New York and head for the Hudson. Why? Because General Howe had sent a fleet as big as the fleet that dropped his army off at Campo Beach up the Hudson to fool Washington and decoy the troops at Peekskill so they didn't respond to the Danbury alarm. There was a possibility Tryon would then march towards those troops, take Peekskill, get on those troop ships, and come back. There was the possibility Tryon would return the way he came, back towards Fairfield. Or he might take the Ridgefield road back towards Norwalk. Or he might do something no one could even have imagined. So you can see these three generals in a rainy night in a home in Bethel saying, what do we do? What they determined to do was a delaying action. By breaking their unit of 600 men, really about 1,000 when you take into account the other troops that had circled around the area, and Wooster would attack from the rear, and Arnold would get in front of the British column once they determined where they were going, and set up a barricade and try to hold them off as long as they could until other militia and maybe the Continentals from Peekskill could arrive. That was the plan. The wild card was another general that most of us haven't heard much of, and that is General Alexander McDougall, who commanded at Peekskill, a favorite of Washington. He had 1,200 Continentals there. Now, a little simple math says that 2,000 British versus 600 or 800 Americans plus 1,200 Continentals kind of evened the score. What if they could arrive on the scene? But McDougall didn't move. Why? This guy. Washington had chosen Danbury as his supply depot. Washington had refused Trumbull 2 times to have Continental soldiers stationed in Connecticut to protect the supply depot as well as the shoreline. Washington ordered McDougall to be ready to march to Philadelphia because he thought the troops aboard the troop ships on the Hudson were headed for Philadelphia. In reality, there were no troops. It was a pure hoax to make McDougall freeze in his tracks, and it worked. Washington was also warned by Brigadier General Parsons on the 21st of April. That's 4 days before the British, 5 days before the British entered Danbury. The enemy, Parsons wrote, will land on the coast about 20 miles from this place and attempt to destroy the magazine of provisions here, Danbury. Washington never replied. He couldn't. He didn't have any troops. This was April of 1777, and the men who had fought at Princeton and Trenton were 6-month recruits who either went home shortly after the battle or stuck around a few months. And the new army of 1777 was only starting to trickle in. Plus, he was fighting smallpox in the rank, and he was ill for 10 days during this period. So he really couldn't do anything, and so he didn't respond. Which takes us to the engagement at Ridgefield itself, okay? The Americans are going to do a pincer movement when Tryon goes on the march. He gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 27th, burns the remaining stores, fakes towards the Hudson, and then heads down the road to Ridgefield through the town of Ridgebury. The engagement that took place there has taken on a different face because we remember it differently as time goes by. History, I say, is a coy mistress who doesn't linger long in yesterday's bed. She seems to keep switching beds. And so it is with the Battle of Ridgefield. It started off as a mere skirmish in Tryon's raid. By the mid-1800s, both England and Patriot America considered it a failure from both sides. It was only until 1927 that historians started looking into it as a battle in its own right. And now we're looking at the National Park Service designating it as a national battlefield site in 2027. The Ridgefield Historical Society is in a phase 2 study for that designation. Now, why is this happening? Well, digital information avalanche. Primary source information is more accessible than at any time in our history for a historian. Not only local archives and family genealogies, pension requests, they used to have to go to DC or get an old piece of microfilm and go through it like this to get to something they were looking for that may be on the 18th roll. And British Archives at Kew in 2017, 70,000 documents from the American Revolution between the Americas and Britain came online. So we get to see the relationship between Tryon and Howe, and it was prickly. We also have Founders Online, which is the historian's staff, if there is one. Everything that our founding fathers wrote could be captured is accessible online. And for Washington, that means everything he wrote during the war is online, and the footnotes explain who was everybody he wrote to. So the most fun thing you can do to follow the American Revolution is plug into Washington and just see what he did during one day, and then the next day, and the next day, and you come away saying, this man is superhuman. He was also super smart because he knew he was making history, and he had scribes who recorded and stored everything he wrote. So it's a rich documentation. And a local historian, Stephen Darley, in 2015 documented every single militiaman from Connecticut and New York who turned out for Tryon's raid. A new resource. And then the National Park Service's Phase 1 study, which is completed, showing how it was truly a battle. Well, let's move on to the battle, because it's moved from a skirmish in the Danbury raid, playing second fiddle to the burning of Danbury, to really the battle now where Tryon's vision for hegemony over Connecticut's southwestern spur was quashed. Well, what took place? A British officer wrote, on the morning of the 27th, the militia began to harass us early and increased every mile as the British left Danbury and were taking the Ridgefield Road back to their ships through Norwalk. The first engagement took place about 1 p.m. The British were lunching in the Ridgebury district, and suddenly, as they were reconstituting their army on the march, Wooster burst through the woods, surprise attack, seized half of the supply train, took up to 40 prisoners, and killed at least 2 redcoats, and then vanished back into the woods before this mile-long British army could coil around in time and deal with him. They didn't follow. They wanted to get back to their ships because Tryon knew the militia were coming from everywhere. He didn't know whether McDougall was coming with the Continentals or not, but he knew they were there, and he didn't want to meet up with that too. About an hour later, Wooster returns. This time he's following the British Army down the Ridgebury Road, and the British, Sir William Erskine, knew it, and so he laid a trap. At a bend in the road, he parked 3 artillery pieces and several companies of redcoats, armed, loaded at the ready. Wooster's men come around the turn, and they open fire. And Wooster, rather than run, says, let's take the first cannon. And he's addressing his men to take the field piece when his horse is shot from beneath him. He gets another horse. He leads them in towards the field piece when it turns out that more redcoats came and were about to envelop his corps. So he orders a retreat, and at that point in time, he was shot, mortally wounded, fell from his horse, was taken back about a mile, and left on the rock for a Continental Army physician to come to his aid from Danbury, and he did. He lived for, I think, another 4 days, and then he died in a home in Danbury, in a loyalist home, because it was the nicest house in town, I guess. The third engagement, which is the one we all know as the Battle of Ridgefield, because it was the major engagement, took place about 3 p.m., and it took place right at the head of Main Street in Ridgefield. There may have been a fourth engagement, as the battle progressed through the streets of Ridgefield. And this is one of the things that the National Park Studies Phase 2 study is out to try and document. Well, the barricade, if you've ever been to Ridgefield and you followed the road down from Danbury to the north, you'll know there are 3 parallel ridges in Ridgefield, and the center one was kind of a notch in the road at the top of the hill. Well, that's where Arnold and his contingent arrived about 2 hours before the British. They built a barricade all the way across, they posted men on the other 2 ridges, and they waited. Now, for the first time, we know there's an order of battle. The page I left here was really a result of the National Park Service study and my first book, because the generals left no description of what was the order of the battle. It was not just a skirmish, it was an organized battle. In the center of the line was the 4th Connecticut Militia. These were the Fairfield and Stratford men, with a few Continentals. The 9th Connecticut Militia was on the right flank. These were the Stamford, Greenwich, Darien men. The 9th Connecticut Militia skirmishers were posted in front. Arnold posted skirmishers out in front to take on the British before they arrived at the barricade. The New York Militia, we're finding New York Militia played a greater role than has been documented in the Battle of Ridgefield. There were at least 9 different companies of New York Militia that fell in with either Wooster or with Arnold. The New York Militia took the left flank, the ridge on the left flank. Horses were taken to the rear, and there was no artillery. Well, this is the battle, and let's walk you through it. I guess there's a sheet here for anyone who can't see this and would like to have a copy of it. Cindy's passing them out from the rear. If we start in the middle, we see where all the arrows are pointing. And you see it looks like a necklace of stones. Those are stone walls of a farm. There's a farmhouse there, and then there's the barricade right where the arrows are pointing for. The 2nd New York Regiment is on the left ridge, and the 9th Connecticut Regiment is on the right ridge. The 4th Connecticut and some Continental soldiers of the 5th and 6th Connecticut line are in the middle, along with Arnold and Silliman. Wooster, of course, is dying and not to be found. His force pretty much scattered. His chief of staff ultimately assembled them, but by then the British had already moved on, and they didn't participate in this phase of the battle. The British open up with bands playing and their grenadiers up in the front making as big an impression as they can, but the Patriot line did not budge. They held their fire. 6 cannon were posted in the rear of the British troops, and they shelled the barricade for up to 15 minutes with 3-pound cannonballs. Flanking parties were sent out to either side to probe whether those 2 ridges were defended, and they found out they were. So they fell back. Then Erskine ordered the cannons, 3 of them, up to the very front of his troops to shell the barricade from closer, and sent Brown's Corps, which are the provincial volunteer, the Loyalist Regiment, over onto his right flank. After about a half an hour of cannonading, Erskine ordered a full attack across the entire front. Both wings attached, and the bulk of his force came right up the Ridgefield Road against the barricade. Now, there were about 600 Patriots there, and there were almost 2,000 British, so the outcome was pretty obvious, and you can only wonder what was going through the minds of those young men and older men behind the barricade, looking at this professional army coming at them. They didn't run. They were full of spirits, incidentally. Part of our research, we found out that Colonel Philip Burr Bradley, whose house was only about 3 blocks from the barricade, had his regimental rum supply in the basement, and rather than have the British consume it, he dispersed it freely to the American troops, to the point where every soldier there had more than a pint of rum available to him. A smart move on his point, and the boys, I'm sure, appreciated the gesture. We know this because in Connecticut archives is his reimbursement request, on which he gives the exact quantity, the exact date, and the exact reason. To refresh the spirit of the troops is what he said. And I guess it did, because they didn't run. But then the entire force came at them. Every one of those redcoats armed with a Brown Bess long wing musket, capable of discharging 3 75 caliber musket balls a minute. A 75 caliber musket ball, is enough to make me shiver, because you think, I have a Winchester 30-30, and I can see what that does when it hits something. A 75 caliber, double the diameter of the, and round besides, so it flattens when it comes at you, is a really terrible killing weapon. And that if you're wounded, the best case is you lose the limb, and recovering from a wound could take a long time. Every one of those young men knew that, and they knew that they were armed with fowling pieces, old Spanish muskets, some French carbines, some Brown Besses, and some guns that their grandfather may have made and passed on. So they knew that they would only be able to get off a few rounds at best. But Arnold was riding back and forth, waving his sword, waiting. And they held their fire until the redcoats were close enough, and then a volley swept the whole American line that was heard as far away as Black Rock. You can imagine the sound going on. Well, what happened was the Browns Corps, the flanking corps that you see on the British right flank, came up between the 2nd New York and the main line. It was a rocky ledge that Arnold didn't think would be passable, but it was. And they got in between those two elements of the American line, and 20 of them came over the top and fired en masse and dropped Arnold's horse, threw him to the ground. And there are many different stories about what happened to Benedict Arnold after that, some of them fanciful, but all of them seem to agree he used his pistol to shoot an approaching redcoat or provincial soldier or officer, and then mounted a horse and ordered to retreat and bolted down the road. You see Main Street going to the south. His whole line falls back. Casualties are taken on both sides, and they make their way to the next designated rendezvous, which was Saugatuck Bridge, where Arnold and Wooster and Silliman the night before had said, this is where we meet when all else fails, because the 2nd Brigade of Connecticut Militia, which is the New Haven troops, another 1,000 men, would probably be there to help them. And that's another story, because half of them did get there, but late. About a quarter of them got there in time to help Arnold make a final attack on the British before they aborted their ships. So if they could have held at Ridgefield another day, the New Haven militia could have been there, plus others, and possibly the Peekskill Continentals, and this British army might have been captured, because boarding an army at sea is a very difficult thing to do, because you're highly vulnerable as you fade away company by company onto the boats. But that was might have been. Well, what happened in terms of the death toll? I guess we always think it can't be a real battle unless people died, right? You can write all you want and get eyewitness pensions report, but if nobody's killed, you can't really say it was a battle. Well, Ben Stebbins, who lived in the house right next to the barricade, wrote that he thought 40 to 50 American lives were lost. General Arnold wrote that Lieutenant Colonel Gould, who was killed at Ridgefield from the 4th Connecticut, and about 20 were killed and wounded at Ridgefield and at Campo. General Silliman, who commanded the militia, said Lieutenant Colonel Gould and 8 or 9 others were killed at Ridgefield. Colonel Hughes, who was a staff materiel officer who was riding through the scene, said there were 32 lost at Ridgefield. So this is what historians had been wrestling with, I guess, until the National Park Service Phase 1 report in my earlier book. So we found out what can be confirmed is there were 12 Americans killed, including Colonel Gould and 4 lieutenants, 28 wounded and 16 captures, for a total of 56. The British, Worcester killed 2, 50 or 60 were killed by Arnold, mostly at the barricade, 4 or 5 officers wounded. The British, when they give their reports, they had the killed and wounded, and then they had the officers as a separate category, and no officers were killed, 4 or 5 wounded, and 10 to 20 men were either missing or captured. So between 124 and 140 people either lost their lives or were taken prisoner at the Battle of Ridgefield. It lasted about an hour. The British camped outside of Ridgefield because the Americans had stalled them long enough that they couldn't keep marching back to their boats. They would not get there. They made camp until next morning. What were the consequences? Well, the first was Danbury Depot itself was shut down. The American supply system was dysfunctional. There were 5 separate departments, each with a head in Philadelphia with Congress, each bargaining for money from Congress, each sending orders out to the field, and the people in the field saying, what the hell were they thinking, and sending the order back. And the foraging system and the purchasing system were in different hands. The quartermaster didn't have control over uniforms. It was really a on-the-fly system that was dysfunctional, and the Danbury raid proved that. So what Congress and Washington did was they moved all depots as a result of this 30 miles inland. They combined the foraging and the wagon department. They gave the quartermaster operation to Washington himself, so he and his generals could manage quartermaster in the field. And they created a monthly inventory and purchasing statement to be given to the Board of War. Hard to realize they didn't have that beforehand. This, of course, only scratched the surface of the dysfunction of the U.S. Army's Supply Corps. It was not until after General Greene took over the quartermaster role after Valley Forge that a true quartermaster function came to be. But Danbury was a first step and a necessary one. The rest fell to General Jonathan Trumbull. Washington moved supply depots, issued orders, but really didn't do much else for the state of Connecticut when it came to British invasion. This is the very essence of a puritanical governor. He was old school, old family, congregationalist, no new light congregationalist, old light congregationalist who was in for the long haul. He galvanized the state. Together with the General Assembly, which he pretty much had his way, 2 new volunteer battalions were raised to defend the state, and 400 Continentals of Connecticut were ordered to Greenwich to guard the border. All militia were then to receive the same pay as Continental soldiers, even though they weren't. So they would turn out in larger numbers. Because he had prisoners now, 40 of them, he needed a commissary of prisoners. And he had to negotiate because Washington would not swap prisoners from the Danbury raid. Why? Redcoats were not swapped for militia. And you can see why Washington wouldn't do that, because the British could go out and grab militia all over the place. He wanted to swap Redcoat prisoners for Continental prisoners, 1 for 1. And you can see the logic in it, but Jonathan Trumbull was then left to negotiate his own prisoner swap, which he did, although probably a third of them died in the sugar house in New York before they could be swapped out. And Newgate, the prison facility in Newgate was expanded. It used to be just a hole in the ground. They put the barracks up to take additional prisoners. It wasn't just prisoners from the Danbury raid. Trumbull also clamped down hard on the loyalist threat in southwestern Connecticut. The oath of fidelity now is required. That is, if you were not already known to be a signed and sealed patriot, you had to take an oath pledging your loyalty to Continental Congress. There was no room for the Tory to maneuver anymore by staying passive. You couldn't travel between towns without a signed loyalty oath, because the loyalists were traveling at night from safe house to safe house to get to Long Island and back to the Crown control. No real estate could be transferred, and no one could vote without the fidelity oath. He had already made it, if you were an inimical, that means a Tory who took action, earlier the General Assembly has said, we take all of your property and we throw you in jail and fine you depending on the whim of the moment. With all of that on top of Tories, the General Assembly did an amazing thing. They then said, any loyalist who will take this oath, we give a full pardon. So this was your chance, if you were sitting on the fence or thinking of being loyal, to wipe the slate clean, because Tryon's army left. There was no uprising. There was no setting people free down the streets. The loyalists looked around, and the people living next door to them were their patriot neighbors. And so taking the oath was probably a good idea. There was another important consequence of the Battle of Ridgefield, and that is Silliman's 4th Brigade was freed up to defend the Hudson Highlands from a British thrust up the river, because Howe never followed up on the incursion in Connecticut because he saw what the cost was. 9% of his troops were killed or wounded or captured. And the uprising that Tryon promised never happened. There were 2,000 Connecticut militia at Saratoga. Many would have been there anyway, but because the New York border was no longer a threat, the southern Connecticut militia were free to move northward. So 2,000 of the 15,000 Americans at Saratoga were Connecticut militia. Probably the greatest consequence, other than Wooster's death and enabling his family to write him off with honor in his last performance on the American stage, Arnold received his second star. The promotion he was passed over for was finally given to him. He also was able to negotiate on his financials from the Valcour Island tour, and he was the man of the hour as far as Congress was concerned. They flipped immediately on Benedict Arnold. He was the hero. He was given a horse to replace the ones that were killed, and John Adams wanted to cast a medal, in fact, proposed a medal for valorous action during the war, and Arnold would have been the second one after Washington. And as we know, at Saratoga, it was Arnold who twice carried the day at Freeman's Farm and Brayman's Raid-Out by disobeying his superior's orders and initiating action in both cases. Without Ridgefield, would Arnold have resigned and not have carried the day at Saratoga? Very likely. Finally, the lasting consequence was the British never came back to inland Connecticut. And Tryon, as the London Evening Post of June 13th told its subscribers, he was selected for this business in hopes his appearance in the country should draw numbers to join him, but it had not that effect. He has no influence beyond New York. And as you know, Tryon was kind of like the bride spurned at the altar with Connecticut. He came back in 1779 and burned Norwalk and Fairfield, and troops under his control also went into New Haven. So the consequences of the Battle of Ridgefield were extensive. This was what it might have looked like if you were right up at the barricade. This is a painting that was done to depict the Battle of Ridgefield with a hatless Benedict Arnold in the rear. Well, that's the story of a battle that was more significant than many of us thought. Maybe the first time any of you even heard about it in a depth, and it brings to mind, imagine that, 900 militiamen standing up to 2,000 British regulars in relative order. Real courage. I'll take any questions. Yes, sir.
I have a question about Benedict Arnold's organization for the battle. Why is it that he had the Lake Connecticut so far over on his flank rather than keeping more contested?
Well, there were 3 parallel ridges, and those flank guards were on the tops of ridges. And so they went down into valleys, and so you would take the high ground, and so anyone would have to take you would have to march uphill, and you'd be much easier to shoot at. I think he knew he wasn't going to hold the ground for that long. He wanted to post men so they could get away. There were militiamen. When dealing with militia, one thing Arnold knew the hard way, and Washington never learned, was you have to give them a route of escape before they'll fire 2 volleys. And so that they had a clear route of escape down the road behind them, and they had the high ground. Yes, sir.
What would be the consequences if the National Park Service does approve this as an official site?
Well, the town of Ridgefield is going to be facing a lot of issues because the main street is where the battle took place, and those are all very nice residences that suddenly are going to be part of a national park zone. And so the politics is going to get very thick. The merchants, the idea of having a national park site with a stream of people with money coming to stay at the hotels and buy things, the merchants kind of think it's a good idea. The Historical Society that I'm still involved with, is drooling over it because, maybe we can buy another old building and have full-time staff just dealing with the battle. And most of the citizens are not too sure. And so the town is going through a series of town hall type of meetings to just get a feel for how heavy do we want to commit if in fact it becomes a battlefield site. Because the battlefield ran all the way from Ridgebury, was a running battle. That's about 8 miles to Ridgefield, and the main street in Ridgefield is a mile long, and the two ridges are like 200 yards to either side. So the scope of it is gigantic. What will determine the answer is the phase 2 study. They're doing metallic resonance imaging of as much of this territory they can to find artifacts and prove where something happened. And what they come up with may determine just how grand the town of Ridgefield has to work around it.
Is Trump cutting back the National Park Service?
We had the money. We applied for it over 2 years ago. Our first application was turned down after the phase 1 study. Why? Because we did not give proper attention to Native Americans. Well, there were no Native Americans in it, but at one time Native Americans had camped among those ridges, and we neglected to build into the study of the Battle of Ridgefield the Native American history of the ridges and the search for artifacts. And so it was turned down. So naturally we employed the help of some Connecticut staffers for the state who knew how to do these things, and we got the right language in and got the money before Trump came to power. And so the money is in Ridgefield's hands.
How much money?
The phase 2 study was $72,000. And so we have Heritage Consultant Group, which does a lot of this stuff, mostly in New England, who did the phase 1 study, is doing phase 2 as well. And joy of all joys, last week, their first dig, they came up with musket balls underneath an old barn in Ridgefield. The barn had been torn down, and they let us dig before, or resonate before rebuilding, and came up with musket balls. Now, that's the big question. So you found a musket ball. Not every musket ball found in the United States was part of a battle against British redcoats. So how do you connect it? You got to find more stuff. Yes, sir.
So, was the plan for the invasion by the British coming through, was that sort of a vanity project by Tryon because it was connected in London, or was that a significant thing that had they succeeded in taking
Well, two things came together at once. Howe had to start the campaign of 1777. We're into April, and he hasn't even gotten the final approval of his plan yet after sending 5 plans to London. So he's got to get off the dime and initiate something. At the same time, Tryon has written and gotten some feedback for his plan about Connecticut and the promise of a major generalship. And then a message comes in from Sir John Johnson, who's a British kind of a Native American go-between up in upstate New York, that the Danbury Depot was ripe for taking. So all of that kind of came together, and Howe made the first move, really, of his campaign to go after the Danbury Depot. Not so much, I think, because of Tryon's loyalists. I think Howe had his eye on Philadelphia, not on Connecticut. But one, he could get Tryon off his back. 2, he could take out a depot that supplied Washington in Philadelphia, and so it would help the greater cause. And 3, he could see, could he really go up the Hudson and meet with the British coming down after all? Would there be any resistance? So I think all of that kind of came together, and it's hard to say what was the straw that broke the camel's back.
It was a raid like the postal ones, but if they had really succeeded, they could have stayed.
If he'd met no resistance, the option of going on to Peekskill and taking on McDougall's troop was a possibility. The option of then going town to town and punishing patriots and dragging selectmen out of their homes and so forth and giving encouragement might have been. Tryon wanted to do that. He was very, very pacific on the march from Campo to Danbury, and he was taking glasses of milk from women. He was disciplining his troops if they were rude to the passerbyers. He wanted everything to back up what he had told London was going to happen. And if the Connecticut militia had not come together in sufficient number to simply say, no, the buck stops here, and no uprising takes place, who knows?
So was there any truth to the question, there are so many loyalists, and one in Connecticut at that point was there. So one way to think about it, and I don't know if you know the answer to this question, when the war was over, there were many, many loyalists who left the country and went to Canada.
Yeah.
Was there a significant number from southwestern Connecticut?
I haven't really proposed that. I know many of the loyalists that I researched in my book did go to Canada, particularly the ones who joined the Provincial American Volunteers, the loyalist unit that fought here. They couldn't come back. I mean, they shot on their own brothers and sisters, and their farms had pretty much been confiscated by that point anyway. So Nova Scotia was really their only option. Somebody, yes, sir.
So the day after, the British camped quite a few miles from the ocean, from the sound. Was there any attempt by the Americans the morning after to try to slow down? Or
I'm glad you answered that, because I'd focused on the Battle of Ridgefield as a battle in itself. What happened next was that Worcester's remnants came together under a Continental colonel in Danbury, Jedediah Huntington, and they were at that time about 400 strong. And Arnold and Silliman regrouped at the Saugatuck Bridge with another 400 or so, and maybe 150 came down from New Haven, the advance guard of the 2nd Regiment, to the Saugatuck Bridge. So Arnold had another pincer movement on hand, this time with more troops, and he had artillery, because Lamb's artillery out of New Haven came down with him. And so he tried to make a stand, but this time the militia broke when the Redcoats charged him, and the Redcoats went to Campo Hill and began descending to their boats, and Arnold wanted a full frontal attack with all of his men and cannons. The cannons broke, the men went up the slope, and then the Redcoats fixed bayonets and charged down the slope at Conco, and the militia panicked and ran and didn't return. So Ridgefield is a little more glorious in terms of the outcome, and if Ridgefield hadn't happened, Campo probably wouldn't have happened either in terms of the outpouring of militia. But yes, it was quite and my book deals in some detail with what happened at Campo, which made Arnold an enemy of the militia for the rest of his career, because they bolted from him twice on the way back as the British were on their way back to the ships. Right, yes.
So for those of us in the audience who are not military historians, could you just explain a little bit, clarify the difference between the Continental militia,
Okay.
the Continental Army, and the...
Well, the Continental Army was a standing army of men in 1777 who signed up for either 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever. They got to pick when they enlisted. So they were full-time there and paid, given uniforms, given the French supplied muskets. They ranged, on the average, there were maybe 12 to 15,000. At their peak, they were up to 30,000 in all of it, right. Toward the end of the war, they were down to 8 to 10,000. The militia, every town had a militia company or two who drilled several times a year and had to respond to the call. If you didn't respond to the call, you'd be dragged before court and punished or fined. If you were in Connecticut between the ages of 16 and 55, then they reduced it to 45 during the war, you were automatically in the militia. Whether you were a loyalist or whatever, you were in the militia. So how many loyalists were kind of faking it by playing militia but not responding, when the call came, who knows?
Was there a finite time that you had to serve, or for...
No, you were in the militia. If there was a war going on and you were older, between 15 and 45, until the war was ended, you were part of the militia. And even afterwards, you were still part of the militia.
So did the militia just come about because of the...
No, the militia came about as soon as Americans landed in New England. In the 1630s, to defend themselves from the Native Americans, they needed a defense force. And King George pretty much was happy with Americans defending themselves, so they didn't have to pay for troops. So every community and every colony created a militia. Some were more organized than others. Connecticut was highly organized. Militia officers were commissioned by the General Assembly. In Massachusetts, for example, companies elected their own officers until Washington put an end to it. And then you get into the Carolinas and whatever. I mean, that was such a bloody civil war going on, determining what was a militia. Very hard to determine at that point. But in New England, it was very clear, 15 to 45, you were a part of the militia. And if you didn't turn out when you were called, you could be taken before a magistrate and punished.
So Worcester and Arnold, let's say, in particular, I'm interested because they are from the Haven. Did they control the militia from the...
Well, the way it worked, let me get back to... There, this is the Connecticut militia. The way it worked was each town had its company of militia. The state organized them into regiments. The regiments were parts of brigades. The General Assembly appointed the generals of the brigades as well as the officers of the regiment. They reported to the governor. Now, a Continental Army officer of superior rank could order the militia to do something, but not of equal rank. If a colonel of Continental ordered a colonel of militia what to do, for all practical purposes, they were still equal rank. Okay? But if a general such as Arnold, who was a Continental Army general, arrives on the scene, he takes priority over the... now, Wooster would still have priority over Arnold because he was a major general. And the two of them put their head together. But it was...
They were both with the Continental.
No, Wooster was militia. He headed this entire Connecticut militia. Okay, he headed all 6 brigades, all 28 regiments reported to Wooster. When Wooster arrives on the scene, the whole militia is under control. Okay? When Arnold arrives on the scene, anything can happen. and did. Okay, one more, and then I guess, yes, sir.
What was it like being a Tory in Fairfield County before the battle? Like, did they have to keep their heads down? Was it sort of like being...
They learned to keep... Their whole business was based on barter. Their neighbors kept them alive by trading things with them. They kept their heads down and just did nothing and said nothing and waited. Okay. At any rate, I do have a few books. If anybody would care to purchase one, I'll be happy to sign it for you in the rear. Thank you.